Good evening. I wanted to initiate this second week of class. One, doing a little introduction to culture. And next week, I'm going to talk in great depth about culture. But I wanted to get some basic terms down and talk in general about some of the controversies dealing with diversity, multicultural, globalization. You've heard a lot of these terms. Also introducing you this week to a video. It's from the 90s. It's a little dated, but it talks about the impact of immigrants coming to the upper Midwest or the Great Plains, for instance, Nebraska, Minnesota, South Dakota, Iowa, Wisconsin, to work in the meatpacking business or other type businesses. And so I know it's a Labor Day weekend. So I'm sure you won't be looking at this immediately on Monday unless you really are bored. But I want to tell you how much I'm excited about issues related to diversity, because I think that's the lifeblood. It keeps things going. Biologically, when organisms interact from different areas, they usually develop stronger. Biologically become stronger because of diversity. So I think intellectually it's very important for us to be interculturally aware of other civilizations, and also to take what is good in those that we might integrate into ourselves. Doesn't mean it's forced upon you, which I think some people are upset, and they think that globalization, multiculturalism is an attempt to destroy their identity. And the last thing it is that, at least in my opinion. But I want to introduce you to culture. The simple term, what is culture? And a lot of people think culture is singing, high culture, haute couture. And that would be opera, paintings. If you look around my room, well, you probably can't see them, but if you could look around my room, you'd see prints of great artists. I can't afford any of the originals. I'm a little broke. But the point is, I like art, I like poetry, I like books. And so I enjoy diversity in terms of thought, because diversity is not just tacos and somebody else's version of food, or a different way of clothing, or a different type of medication, or any of those things. It's all of those things. It's all of those things we may integrate into our culture. But lately, especially in the last 10 years, 20 years, there's been a lot of fear about that which is from the outside. Another term for that is xenophobia, which means fear of foreigners, and that's very common, and it does occur. It occurs in all kinds of places in history. That's why we had wars against people that were different, tribal wars, whether Native American or in Europe, the Swedes versus the Germans, and the French versus the English, and so forth, and interior civil wars over different groups or different religious groups. We had a lot of religion wars in Europe. The 7 Years' War was a big one. I think there was a 40 Years' War, and then, of course, the 100 Years' War, which actually lasted 116 years, from 1353 to 1333 to 1453, something like that. 1337, 1453, 116 years. Well, what was the cause of a lot of this conflict? Well, it was fear of change and people being very aggressive. And I'm going to put these in a terminology, but not this week. I'll talk about that, because I think, first of all, we have to clinically calm down and analyze the situation. Emotions do not lead to great breakthroughs in thinking. They usually lead to errors and emotional extremism. So what I want to talk about? Well, first thing, real simple. What is culture? Now I'm going to show you three things, or several things here on my desk. Something you may have heard of. This is an amphora. It's a cheap toy knockoff, but It's a type of ceramics and sculpture. It was used in ancient times by the Greeks and Romans, and they would put olive oil or wine or all kinds of things, fish sauce in here. And they're always finding these, and sometimes they still have the fish sauce in them. Not very tasty after 2,000 years. I've heard of people drinking wine 2,000 years old. It was pretty rough, especially being in the sea. Which is another thing. I've got a book here called The History of Western Philosophy. Western meaning European. Starts back with the Greeks, before Socrates. There's a guy named Thales. He was considered one of the pre-Socratics and lived in the islands off of Turkey, which were part Greek at that time. And his theory was, he looked at the world and he didn't know what it was made of. And he finally decided that everything's made of water because there's lots of water. There's water in the human body. There's water in wine. Even the earth has water in it. So he thought somehow that water is like the basic element, whatever water is, and everything else is made from it or comes from it. You might say that didn't seem very logical, but it was using his perceptions. He didn't have an electron microscope. He didn't have chemistry, hadn't been invented yet. No one thought it up. So he thought everything was made of water. Then eventually the Greeks, you may remember, thought there were 4 substances in the world. What were they? Things they couldn't explain. One of them was water. One of them was earth. One of them was wind, the air. They knew the air existed because it blew them down and it was invisible. And the 4th one was fire, because they didn't know what exactly was happening in a fire, but they knew things changed in a fire. So they thought fire itself was a substance. That's one of the ideas they came up with. It was the basis for medicine. They had theories about liquids in the body, like bladder fluid and different types of fluids in the body, including blood. And they thought that some imbalance in these fluids caused people to be ill. Up until the time even of George Washington and afterwards, people thought that if you were sick, it was because something's wrong with your blood. So what did they do? They went to the barber, and the barber bled you. He'd make a cut and he would drain blood out of your body because they thought with less blood you would be healthier. Now, of course, that killed a lot of people. George Washington was bled when he came down with probably strep throat. We don't know what killed him, but bleeding him did not make him stronger. It made him weaker and probably hastened his death. But people had to have some way of thinking about the world. So one of the things that culture is what do we believe? Not just religious, but what do we believe about the nature of the world? Before there was people knew about atoms. There actually were people in ancient Greece that came up with the idea that atoms must exist. They had no idea what they were talking about. They said, there must be a piece that's smaller than the smallest thing you can see, and that is the piece that makes up everything else. Of course, they didn't know there were different atoms. They didn't know there were smaller parts like quarks and electrons and protons. They didn't have a technology that would allow them to even explore that concept. It was beyond them. But at least they came up with the idea of the atom. But it didn't exist for a long time. It wasn't popular because people thought something else must be the answer. So it's what people believe. You know, you believe in the Cornhuskers. That's part of your belief system. It may not be that critical to you. You may be a Christian, or you could be Muslim or Buddhist or Hindu or something, or an animist who believes in just the spirits of rocks and things, or believe in nothing. You could be an atheist, but you still have a philosophy. You still have a way of thinking about the world. So what you believe or what you think is one pillar of culture. Wherever you go, people have to believe in something. They may be like you. They may be Catholic. May not be like you. They may be Buddhists, or they may have some other system. Or they may have a belief in something that's not really religion as you see it at all. It's alien to what you think. So that's one thing. Okay, so it's what you believe, or what a person or a group believes. People die because of that. That's why they had religious wars. Politics is a matter of belief. If you believe something strongly enough, and you could have a civil war, you have to decide, what do you believe about tolerance and accepting other people? Do you believe that if you're right, any amount of force is excused? We do know that Hitler believed that. He thought force makes right. But individuals can believe that too. And usually it has unfortunate consequences, like it did with Hitler. What is something else? Well, Americans always give it away when they go overseas. And they go someplace and they talk to people and they say, oh, your name's Jennifer Brown, and you're from England. What do we ask next? I ask you. What do you do? We don't generally ask them what they believe, because we're not, by our nature, Americans, we don't usually start out by asking you, what is your belief system? We tend to ask something we think is more comfortable. What do you do? I'm a librarian. I'm a farmer. I'm a teacher. I'm a tech person. I'm a baseball player. Okay? By the way, this was autographed by Buck O'Neill, who was the last manager of the Negro League team, the Kansas City Monarchs, back in the 50s. Very special hat to me. So what do you do? And Americans really are interested in that. In some countries, it's considered rude to ask people about their employment. Why would that be? A lot of reasons. It could be that, first of all, in some countries, you don't go up and start chats with strangers and then begin talking about your family, what you do in your whole life, because you're assuming something. You're assuming they want to hear that. And in some places, that is not acceptable. You do not go up and start a conversation with a stranger. You haven't been introduced. You are violating the rules. Now here we think that's just dandy, but dandy doesn't carry it in many other places. I'm just thinking of what I've heard about Americans in Europe and stuff. What's another thing? Well, we got what you do, we got what you believe, and then we have this. Do any of you recognize this? It doesn't have the battery in. This is what I use to detect minor or small electrical impulses in the air or in the area. It's actually used for ghost hunting. And if you've ever watched those shows, these things light up. I took the battery out, so if it lights up now, I'm jumping and running. So this is, it's called a milligauss meter or something. They call it a K2. People use it to look for ghosts. But here's something you may be familiar with. A cell phone. And of course, our old amphora. What is it they have in common? They are artifacts, like an arrowhead, a stone axe, an arrow, a spear point, a buffalo robe, a cowboy hat, any kind of food you can imagine, pizza, tamales, everything. It's what people make, or their artifacts, what they leave behind. One of my favorites is this, which is a whiskey bottle, and it was called a coffin whiskey bottle, shaped a little bit like a coffin. It was brought from Fort Sydney, and it was dug out there by a amateur trash hunter, or maybe archaeologist or something. But it wasn't scientific, but he dug trash dumps, and this is what the soldiers out there drank their whiskey in. This came in whiskey, and they just filled it up. Not a lot of labeling or anything. It may never have been a label. And they did drink it, and then they'd shoot and stuff. So they found a lot of these whiskey bottles, some of them not broken. And then I can't get it out, I don't think, but I have an actual bullet casing, not a bullet, but a bullet casing. And that's where they stationed, I heard, the Buffalo Soldiers, who were African-American cavalry soldiers who served in the Indian Wars and then a lot of other issues. They're very sensitive, Native Americans. And so that's an artifact. People made that. They put whiskey in it. Whiskey was an artifact. So we got what people make, what people believe, and what people do. That's culture. 3 categories. I'll talk about it more next week. The culture is very rich, and when we talk about diversity, of course, we have different countries, different environments, different whole histories, different languages, different social systems, everything different. Some of it similar because human beings have 2 arms, 2 legs. They have a certain concept probably of family, but they have different ways of practicing it. They have a different belief system. So it's diverse depending on where on the globe you are. And wherever you are, depending on how isolated you are for how long or something, you may become totally, you may not know about the outside world. And there are many cases of this. Probably one of the most famous ones is when Columbus landed and you had the whole new world, which basically did not know that there were other people in the world. You had Columbus arrive, you had the Spanish, you had other explorers, and believe me, it was a disaster. And why was it a disaster? Diseases, which are part of culture in Europe, but were not part of culture here. People had no defense. Once smallpox or even measles or any of these diseases started spreading, they just spread uncontrollably. And so, for the most part, the diseases spread from the Europeans to the Native Americans. I'm making a general statement. I'm willing to take that back if the evidence goes the other way. But that's only illnesses and things. We have different customs. We have different concepts about marriage, relationships of men and women. These things, sexual orientation things, some of these things were different at different times in history. Now, obviously, a lot of issues come up now, which we'll talk about in this class to deal with orientation. Everything from, I have a video on basically gay history, I guess I would call it, but it's just kind of a basic one. And the idea that wasn't even discussed when I was a kid. We didn't talk about gay. The word gay didn't mean what it means now. It was never had that meaning. We didn't know that meaning. And so everything changed because language has changed. Language and culture are intertwined. You can't really even talk about thinking if you don't have a language with which to think. Think about that. Think about it without using language. That's really tough, So those are some of the basic ideas I wanted to put out there. There's some terms that I have on the assignment I sent to you. Now, when we get into more next week, we get into Banks, the first chapter. He's going to be talking about 4 different ways that we can teach about multicultural issues or talk about diversity. And just quickly to give you a preview on that, one is called contributions. And that's a lot of times when you say, oh, so-and-so from Sweden gave us IKEA. Okay, I think that's Swedish furniture, right? All right, that's different. I never knew about Swedish furniture. I didn't know there was anything unique about it, or they had furniture different than we did. So that's something really modern. But then there are other people that invented, Gutenberg, a German, invented the printing press. Before they just carved everything on wood and they just printed it as a block. But he invented the printing press, and then later somebody else, invented movable type, which made it possible to quickly put together a printer and ink it and be able to produce a large number of newspapers. So suddenly, instead of a scribe like in ancient Egypt writing one little thing at a time, with ink and very valuable papyrus or writing on wax that doesn't last. Suddenly you had a permanent sheet of paper, or semi-permanent. Now we have computers. We put things in there, we think it's gone, but it's not gone. It's there somewhere, somebody can find it, okay? So those are different aspects of culture. Technology is a big part of culture. I said sexual orientation. We can go on and on. We can talk about food, we can talk about clothing, we can talk about customs, everything. You can talk about the use of tobacco in other cultures. We could talk about medicine across cultures. Anybody here had acupuncture? That sounds pretty odd. We're going to stick a little needle in your skin, and somehow that's going to cause you to be comfortable enough we could do surgery on you without any medication. Or I'll hypnotize you and do brain surgery or something. I don't know. But the idea is that the concept of culture is virtually everything that humans touch and think about. Culture is not, we don't have the culture of beavers and black bears and things like that. Now they have a biological environment, but we haven't extended that too much than them. Some people think dolphins have language and whales have language and there's communication between plants. I mean, weird stuff like that. And there may be something to it biologically. Maybe there's something about how we develop language. But right now we just don't know. I mean, I'm open to any possibilities. Okay, what are some other terms that come up in this course? You've heard the term melting pot. It was often used to try to explain how America is just a big happy melting pot. You just throw more stuff in and it becomes Americanized. We have American cheese. We have American companies now, Walmart and stuff. We think, oh, that's American, but the idea of a melting pot wasn't very cool for a lot of people because they wanted certain people were okay to melt together, but not others. Or they called it race mixing. They were opposed to it. Obviously, it had a lot to do with the animosity and the racism from the Civil War and slavery, that terrible tragedy in our cultures like a scar. But also, people were opposed to marriage between Native Americans and whites. They were opposed to people marrying across religions. They were opposed to people marrying across different ethnicities. You know, they're Danish and they're Norwegian. Oh, we could never get together. Now, for some of us, we'd laugh at that and say, well, I have a Danish great-grandfather and a Polish great-grandmother, and they're on different sides and different people. And we think, what does that make a difference or not? But our sensitivity on issues of skin color and the racism and our attitudes about certain cultures that were kept at a distance or were oppressed or were avoided, whatever you want to call it. And that's in many cultures. I'm not condemning anything just particular about American culture, that there were inequities and negative stuff said about many cultures. Other terms, ethnicity, what does that mean? You know, I'm Hungarian, I'm ethnic. You know, ethnicity a lot of times doesn't mean a whole lot because how many people are actually Hungarian now, even though they may have great-grandparents and parents that are Hungarian, but they're in the United States and they don't do things like they do in Hungary. So it's really a rough one. Probably the biggest, and I'll talk more and more about this in this class, is the term race. People thought for a long time there were races of people, and they did this according to skin color and certain physiological features. So they thought there were people from Eastern Asia, from Polynesia, people from the Aborigines in Australia, and that you could classify them by the way they looked and by the way their skin color and some other physical attributes. Same with people from India and Middle East, Africa, different places in Africa, South America, Native Americans, Europeans. And we saw the horror of that because under Nazi Germany, they really believed it and taught it to people as a science, and it was complete garbage because the term race is meaningless. except when it's used to hurt people. That's my opinion. Trying to classify people by some the nose or their ears or something. And this was done in a pseudo-scientific attempt before Nazi Germany, but it was accentuated in Nazi Germany. So they tried to murder people who were Jewish. It didn't matter if they were brilliant mathematicians or scientists or musicians or artists or ballerinas, etc. They were to be killed because of their so-called race or ethnicity, whatever you want to call it, destroying huge numbers of people in most cruel conditions, locking them up, making all kinds of horrible arguments about them that go all the way back into anti-Semitism for thousands of years, or all the way back, a long way back. So we know the evils of that in the Holocaust. And so people kind of step back and say, well, we know the Holocaust is bad. And I said, what about Native Americans and how they were treated? How about how people were treated from Europe when the first people from Southern Europe came to the United States, and whether they were Greek or Hispanic or Spanish or Italian, and they were discriminated against. People didn't want to be around them. They were against them. And then after a while, this stuff kind of disappeared. After time, people mixed, and I wouldn't call it a melting pot, because the melting pot has the idea you just become everybody else and everybody else becomes you a little bit. It doesn't show the distinctions in our cultures. So these terms, while people bandied them about, and they still use these terms, we have them on a census thing, identify as what, what is white anyhow? What does that mean? Is it Greek white? Is it Irish white? Is English white? And what is black, or what is Hispanic? These are really easy terms that I found so many people that they don't even know. Some people don't have to answer these because they're kind of like Tiger Woods. They have mixed and they're different, and they just say, look, you don't have to answer those questions, by the way. They may want you to answer those questions. I had people call up and say, please answer that question. I said, but you told me I didn't have to write down. I don't have to identify myself. But it makes it easier because we can show we're hiring people, So the term race and ethnicity has far more negatives than it has any positives. Other issues that come up are documented, undocumented, referring to the status of people. Is there such a thing as an illegal alien, an illegal immigrant? Some people would say definitely, absolutely, and others would say no human being is illegal. What's really interesting about this is that our own language becomes the instrument to expose us. Even those of us that think, oh, we kind of got a handle on this. But I say things even on here that can be controversial and can be questioned. We know that we use the term people of color, but we don't say colored people. Now, do you know why we don't say that? If you don't, it'd be good to look that up. I'll talk about it later, but not immediately. But the term people of color is accepted. It's I don't call it politically correct. I call it how people like to be called if they want to show some differentiation. But the word colored people is never used and is insulting. Okay. I would like you to look that up if you don't know why, because that's very important. I ran into people who have the weirdest ideas about things like that. And you have to pay attention in our culture because the use of language can damage relationships if you use the wrong terms. Think about issues like the way women are treated. A big one was that people would use the term girls when they referred to women who were from I guess women of color would be called, but they'd use the term girls instead of women. Like, how old do you have to be a woman in certain ethnic groups or way they're classified? Because that's insulting. I'm not a girl. If you call me a boy, you can see I'm probably older than a boy, but thank you. I would say that I'd say, well, yeah, I'm a man, but I wouldn't be so insulted about it because I don't have a history from my background of anyone like me being insulted by being called that. But you use it in other cultures, the word boy, and it is pure racist term and insulting. And most people, when they use terms like that and then say, look, I didn't know what I said. Well, they usually know what they say. That's why it's very important that there are trigger words in the culture and you have to know what those are. Now, okay, I've talked about melting pot. Assimilation is one really interesting. Now, assimilation, you can look it up, but what does it mean? Well, you become like one of the rest of us. We all come like each other. But I've seen people very enraged when someone said, you need to assimilate. You need to be like us. Because what you're saying when you do that is you're saying, you need to become like me in order to be okay. Because what you are, that's the assumption, see. That's the what comes before. How you are is not acceptable. But once you're more like me, then you'll be acceptable. That means what you are now is not acceptable. People aren't usually dummies. They know when they hear an insult. And so I mentioned those other terms. Of course, a lot of the history in our thinking in the United States is white-black conflict. But what I'm going to talk about in terms of diversity is not centered on, this is the American issue with multiculturalism. The issues that we're going to talk about in this class, I can find them in India, I can find them in Pakistan, I can find them in China among different groups. I can find them in Africa, I could find them in large cities. It doesn't have to have anything to do with physical looks. It could be a group, it could be issues about sexual orientation, or it could be issues about social class. Or it could be between union and non-union households, or it could be between people in the middle class and people in the upper class. These conflicts, how people look and see how they're different from each other or view themselves as different, and how if they feel they're not treated with respect, then they're always looking for certain code words that are going to put them down. I don't have the pleasure right now of just asking you questions directly, but just think about where you're from and either who your friends are or who you are or who your family is. Have you ever seen conflicts in your local town or in your region where certain people didn't get along with another group? It could be as primitive as two different families not liking each other. Romeo and Juliet. The families were at war with each other. It wasn't even tribal, it was family on family. It could be men and women. Arguments about access to birth control, issues about abortion, issues about voting, issues about jobs and equal pay. You can find that will fall into a male-female, because if you find the women are getting paid less money, then there's going to be a basis for a grief there or a complaint. Different groups, people when they perceive they're different or feel they're being treated differently in a negative way, what about abilities, disabilities? What about if you have a child and that child, or you have a cousin and you have a child, or a grown adult and they have needs because of a physical, mental, or emotional condition of some sort? that makes it more difficult for them to operate in society. Could be literally as simple, not simple, but as common as having to use a wheelchair, not being very mobile. There can be all kinds. So we can spend, what I like to do in this class is we're going to be talking a lot about things that are conflicts in cultures. And I definitely don't want to just focus on American culture, because that itself is pretty blind, because there are conflicts all over the world. I'm going to be giving you a kind of a rubric which goes about talking about 3 different ways that groups interact or individuals interact because of differences. And it's going to be simple. It's going to be only 3 situations coming up. And then within those, what are some things you can do to solve the problem? Because with this class, I want to each week also get added in, what can you do in your class to promote either some sort of cultural understanding. I don't like the word tolerance, because tolerance sounds like you're putting up with people. That's the term I use, primitive little word phrase. Oh, I can tolerate you. Now, where I come from in the country, if I said I can tolerate you, it means I can put up with you. Doesn't mean I'm very friendly toward you. So if someone says I can put up with my cousin, I don't want him to visit very long. I can tolerate him for a day or 2, but then he has to move on. It's not really a real friendly approach. If you're a teacher, which most of you are, and you're going to tolerate students, well, that's not really acceptable, because if I have to tolerate them, that doesn't sound like I have to put up with them in my class, something very unpleasant. And then you get down and you talk about, what about my feelings? What if I feel I'm not being treated fair, or this situation's imposed on me? That's when we got to do the work of finding common ground, of compromise, of trying to have in our heart to do the best we can for others without selling out or humiliating ourselves. That's the balance. If someone comes up and they say, I want party B to win this election. And you say, but if party B wins this election, what does that mean? What are they going to be saying about me? What are they going to do to me? What rights are they going to take away from me? Whatever party it is. It's all over politics now. We know that, this division. It wasn't that bad 30 years ago, but it's accentuated in the last few years. But it's not some uniquely American situation. It's not. The conflicts across other cultures are so powerful, and they exist in many regions. And in the United States, despite when we lament our condition in certain either political or cultural conflicts or things, religious, there are much worse conflicts in the world, with far more at risk. And, we haven't resorted to genocide and massacre and stuff, at least not in this century, 21st century. But we do know that in the old days that Native Americans were just wiped out. They were wiped out like they were some creature that the earth didn't need anymore. People didn't want them around anymore. They didn't want them on their land. Took their land and they wiped them out of existence. I think that's called genocide, my friends. Well, that happens all over the place now in the world. So we're dealing with pretty difficult conditions. So when you're teaching kids, you can't, throw the ugliness of the world in their face. Kindergartners don't understand the Holocaust. But there are ways of building understanding and compassion for different groups of people, so that when they're older, they will have a basis for respecting that group. Okay. And by the way, multiculturalism is certainly fighting words for a lot of people. And I want you to know that, because if you think everybody's just gonna, I always like to use some other terms. Sometimes let's talk about getting along. Let's talk about being kind. I don't care what terms you use. We don't have to stick ourselves on words, but we should stick ourselves on compassion we have toward others. A few other terms I've used, because I don't want to talk too long. Uh, well, banks, when you read the first chapter of banks, it talks about four things: contributions, which is what did they do for us? I was talking about that a while ago and I got off track. Additive, which means kind of like, you know, for instance, an African American man is the one who came up with the concept of transfusion of blood, but I don't believe he got credit for it. A woman came up with the idea and was involved in when they discovered DNA and the way it spirals around. Yet when you look in the history book, she was forgotten for many, many years. She should have received a Nobel Prize too. But there were three guys and this lady scientist, and she was left out. And then there's what they call transformative and social action. So Banks is going to be talking about very activist approach. That's his theory in the book. I don't expect you as teachers to go to activism. I'm not opposed to activism. In fact, I do like it. But I do know that in certain communities, you have to think carefully about your activism. Or if you're going to make some changes in your community, you have to be willing to be very patient. Yet, you don't want to find yourself just nodding and going along with stuff that is utterly wrong. See what I mean? Each teacher, each person has a level where they say, I can live with something to a point, and then I can't go along anymore. Okay. A more, someone's at your Thanksgiving meal and they start critiquing you on how you made your turkey and the dressing. And they can say a few things, but then if the in-law or the mother-in-law says too much, then there's problems. Then there's hurt feelings and stuff. So you want to be the person that you're aware of this so that you either can forgive the mother-in-law or father-in-law. It could be either one. I don't want to pick on one or the other. But you know there's a certain point at which you can tolerate it. And then what do you do to kind of put your foot down, stand up for yourself? People that teach multiculturally should not be in the business of running over and hurting other people's feelings. Now, educating is one thing, disrespecting is another. And that's what makes it hard. I'm not going to go into a community that has a certain set of beliefs and tell them they're wrong. You people are blank, blank, blank. But can I work within some aspect of the community to build a bridge gradually to bring you some understanding? I believe you can. We got a real right or wrong, correct, incorrect culture. It's either this way or that way. It's black and white. There is no gray. Well, unfortunately, most of culture is gray. Okay, well, that's all I got to say tonight. I'm going to put on a video about new faces on Main Street, and I hope you like it. The documentary will be about that. And then you can read first chapter in Banks for next week. Thank you. And we do have a discussion, and it'll just be discussion. Also, I do want to do Zoom with you guys at some point, so look forward to that.